Welcome back, 365 Sports. Evan Miyakawa, evanmiya.com, the king of basketball numbers. I'm just going to tell you right now, nobody does it like Evan. Evan, I read an article earlier today from Brendan Marks from The Athletic that says that this year is the chalkiest year possible because that's what the data says. Please tell me that's not true.
Well, I think it's chalky from the sense that we're most likely to see a 1 seed or a 2 seed winning the national title or making a Final Four this year. The crop of 1 seeds this year is very, very dominant. Every single one of them, according to my tournament simulations, has at least a 15% chance of winning the title game. And you add that up, that's about 70% chance that we're going to see a 1 seed winning the whole thing. They all have a relatively straightforward path to a Final Four. Now, I think it's very possibly we're going to see some first-round upsets in the 5-12, 6-11, 7-10 games, that kind of thing. But in terms of seeing like major Final Four upset potential with what we had a couple years ago with Florida Atlantic and Miami and that kind of year, I just don't really think that's as likely in the cards this year just because the top is so dominant. There's probably 4 or 5 teams this year who have really separated themselves, and then the teams that would really compete with those are also pretty close to the level. You're looking at teams like St. John's and Michigan State and Tennessee, who are not the title favorites, but still have a chance of doing well. And then there's a pretty large gap to the rest of the teams. So I think we could see some early chaos. When it comes to the Final Four, I think this could be one of the more chalky Final Fours we've seen.
Yeah, because, we were talking about Duke earlier, Evan. If you told me, like if I didn't know that Cooper Flagg existed and I turned on Duke in the ACC tournament after he was out with no sound on so I couldn't hear them talking about how Cooper Flagg was not there constantly, I would think that they were one of the best teams in the country without him. That does lead to do they even need him this first weekend is a huge question.
I do not think Duke needs him. They'll be totally fine without him in their first game, and they should be totally fine without him against either Baylor or Mississippi State. I think that they're that good. Now, I do think there is, though, a certain amount of if Cooper Flagg really is close to being available, it's a morale boost for your team to even just let him play a little bit in that first weekend, just because then it's basically like, hey, we're not really concerned about this going into the Sweet 16. And two, there can be just a little bit of a mentality thing where, if he hasn't played at all, even though he could, and then they're only up 3 points with 4 minutes to go in their second round game, they could be thinking maybe we should be playing Cooper Flagg. So I think there's almost like a mentality thing that they have to deal with too. But obviously you need to prioritize his health, because if this team really is going to be the front runner to win the national title, which I believe they are, they do need Cooper Flagg healthy. And so you don't want to risk him early if there really is any concern that he's not going to, not re-injure himself.
So and just looking at that part of the bracket, there are some teams. Look, if Baylor gets through, they can score at their peak, right? Not sure Baylor's healthy enough to do that. I think that's the big question about Baylor. Arizona can score if they get through. Again, BYU scores a ton. Wisconsin scores a ton. Alabama scores a ton. But none of them have the defensive metrics that Duke does, do they?
No, Duke's defense is phenomenal this year. I think they're probably one of the top 3 or 4 defensive teams in the country. They're certainly the most athletic team in the country, and the way that they are able to physically and athletically stop you from doing what you want to do, I don't think is matched by any other team. There are certainly some other teams like Houston and St. John's whose defenses are so stingy, and they're just going to get at you for 40 minutes a game. But Duke's athleticism is a different kind of beast. And so in that region, they're really the only big team in that region who poses that kind of defensive threat. Like you mentioned, Bama's more of an offensive team than a defensive team. They can score in the 90s, but they've had struggles giving up points this year. Wisconsin, similar thing. Arizona, again, more of an offensive team. I think they're pretty balanced this year. But like you mentioned, there's really not another defense in that East region that really stacks up with Duke's.
Let's move down to the Midwest. And Houston, very, very good on both sides of it. I mean, they score, they play defense. Jawan Roberts has been hurt, but he'll probably play at least some. Maybe he doesn't play the first weekend. I'm not sure that they totally need him to either. Kind of not in the same level as Cooper Flagg, but they showed that, through the Big 12 tournament, he wasn't there and they won.
Yeah, I mean, Houston is the kind of team that does not overly rely on one player. And if you have a player out, if there's any team that can overcome it, it's Houston. I mean, Juwan Roberts obviously is a key cog for this team. Not only is he one of the best players on this team, he's by far the veteran leader on this team. He's been around for a really long time. He is Houston DNA. I know in their senior night game, he was the one player that caused Kelvin Sampson to cry just because Juwan Roberts means so much to him in that program. But yeah, honestly, if I'm scouting Houston and I'm not sure that Juwan Roberts is available, it does not change anything about how I prep for that game or what I'm expecting from Houston, because their entire team, from player 1 down to player 8 or 9, they all play with the exact same intensity, and they are a collective unit that is very, very strong. So yes, obviously it would hurt Houston if Juwan Roberts is not available in the first couple games. I still think he probably will be to a certain extent, but even if he's not, I'm not overly concerned that it's going to massively change their outlook. Honestly, their biggest test, though, is a potential second-round game against Gonzaga. Gonzaga, as some people know, is an analytical metrics darling. They're a top 10 team according to my site. Really, really tough draw, honestly, for both Houston and Gonzaga to be paired with each other in that second-round game, because Houston, their toughest game on their path to the Final Four could be that second-round game. So that might change a little bit of the urgency for Juwan Roberts' injury situation, just based on if he's available for that potential matchup or not.
Yeah, Evan, I've just submitted my bracket in the challenge, and with some media guys from Radio Row, and I and you know this about me, my alma mater is Florida State. I don't see anybody getting the Gators right now. It's hard because they're deep, and Todd Golden has this ridiculously good offense. But they do, like, of all the teams that, you go through and look, it appears to me that they might have the toughest go of it when you've got St. John's and Texas Tech as your 2 and 3 seed.
Yeah, I think that region, the West region, is the toughest region, really, for any of those top Final Four contenders in that area. The thing with Florida is, if you looked even a couple months ago, I wouldn't have necessarily put them in the firm title favorite tier, but they have definitely risen to that. I think they have the third best odds to win the whole thing of any team in the country, according to my simulations. But like you said, there are some really tough teams. I've heard some people argue that of all the 2 seeds, St. John's right now is the one that you want to face the least. So a Florida-St. John's game, that's a pretty tough draw for Florida. And then, Texas Tech at times this year has been one of the top 6 or 7 teams in the country. They're dealing with a little bit of an injury bug right now. But if they were to get through the first weekend or two, they would be very strong opponent. Maryland is according to my team ratings, one of the strongest non-top 3 seeds we have in the field, and they have the best chances of making a Final Four of any team outside those top 3 seed lines. So I think that's a tough matchup. So yeah, I think their road is tough. I still think they are definitely the overwhelming favorite or most likely team from that region to get to a Final Four, but the path there is certainly not as easy as it could have been for them in other regions. And I think I would just caution people a little bit. We often really track this kind of momentum going into the tournament. Florida is definitely one of these teams where they have just been absolutely dominant. I don't know if you could argue there's been a better team in the country heading into the tournament than Florida right now. So maybe that's going to carry them all the way to a Final Four, but you also have to remember Todd Golden has not won a single NCAA tournament game. So this is a new territory for him and for his players, even though he does have some veterans like Elijah Martin who have been there before. This is going to be kind of a new territory for the Florida Gators.
They have, and they've just come through. I mean, look, Evan, they've had a weird year. I mean, earlier in the year that you thought that maybe Todd Golden was going to get suspended at least because there was a Title IX investigation into him. That gets cleared, and they just went after that. It's like for him in particular, I guess a weight was lifted, and they just ran with it. And watching it in the SEC tournament this last week, and what was the deepest league in the country this year, was just kind of a revelation.
Did you know that most calorie deficit calculators don't work? My dietitian recommended the Lasta to me, and it turned out to be the only one that got my calorie deficit right. Thanks to it, I lost 14 pounds in 1 week. Ready to kickstart your journey to healthy weight loss? Calculate your ideal calorie deficit using the Lasta app right now.
Yeah, it's been honestly astounding that they were able to overcome all of that uncertainty around their camp and around what was happening with their head coach, and that they were still able to just continue to just bull through the SEC. And they have arguably the most impressive win in the country on the road at Auburn. They handled them comfortably in that game. So they've shown that they can beat anyway. They can handle anybody. Obviously, playing in the SEC is going to prepare you for anyone that you would face in the tournament. So I don't really think there's going to be any surprises for this team. I will say that over the course of the season, this is something they've gotten better at recently, which I really think has elevated them to another tier. But early in the season, the first half of the season or so, Florida was one of the most volatile teams in the country from game to game in terms of having good performances and bad performances. They cleaned that up a little bit recently, but that's still a trend that I'm monitoring for this team, because on their best night, they can beat anyone. On their worst night, they have struggled. So we've not seen that recently. And so hopefully, if you're a Florida Gator fan, you're hoping that continues. But we'll see what happens.
I want to stay in this bracket for a second on Kansas, Arkansas, St. John's, Omaha, that little part of it. Kansas, I feel like they match up very well against Arkansas. I think that's a really good matchup for them. Like as a team that's not been themselves all year long, or actually for the last 2 years, this is, to me, in a 7-10, probably maybe the best they could have hoped for, in that you also get a team with expectations. I think it'd be much more dangerous for them to play a team like Utah State or New Mexico, just because those are the teams that kind of jump up and get you, as where I don't think there'll be surprises with Arkansas. And ultimately, more than likely, it's a matchup against Rick Pitino for either of them. How do you see that part of the bracket working out?
Yeah, that's a great point about, the fact that Kansas, not only is this matchup favorable for them, but I also think going into this game, it's not just going to be about, is Kansas going to, fumble the bag here? Because Arkansas limped into the tournament. A couple weeks ago, we didn't think this team was heading to the tournament. They've turned it around and have been good. But, it's John Calipari in his first year at Arkansas, largely been a disappointment compared to the roster talent. They've got arguably their best player coming back in Boogie Fland, but is that actually going to be a good thing for Arkansas because he's not been playing for a while and he's a freshman? I don't know. So I think that takes a little bit of the pressure off of Kansas, because it's going to be as much about Arkansas in this game as Kansas. And so I think maybe Kansas is going to feel a little bit like they can just play with a chip on their shoulder and just take them to town here. I do have Kansas favored comfortably in that game. My model gives them a 71% chance of winning, 6-point favorite. So I really like Kansas. I've been a Kansas backer for most of the season relative to where everyone else has been on them. I think their roster talent is really good, and I think that their coach obviously has a proven track record. And oftentimes teams like this who were highly rated in the preseason, let's remember Kansas was preseason number 1 in the AP poll. They often, if they have disappointing regular seasons, can often kind of rebound and revert back towards preseason expectation in the tournament. Kansas exactly fits the bill for that. So I expect them to beat Arkansas in that first game and then give St. John's a tough game in round 2. I still think, I'd pick St. John's to win that game, but I think Kansas is a pretty scary second round opponent for any 2 seed.
I would look forward to a Tech and St. John's matchup if that happens. Now, look, Tech has got to get through Missouri or Drake. I'm picking Drake. I love Ben McCollum. That might be my emotional pick. Am I crazy there?
I think that I'm just kind of thinking about this now. Like, Missouri kind of was a Final Four sleeper pick even like a month ago, and they've been a lot more dicey down the stretch. And so, yeah, I think Drake definitely could have upset potential there for sure. I think Drake, they've basically been proving all season that they can punch above their weight. They have a bunch of guys who are D2 just a year ago. Their coach is maybe one of the best in this tournament based on what he's done with their roster. And, Dennis Gates for Missouri, this has been a great year for them. If you remember, they were winless in SEC play, if I remember correctly, last year, and they've been amazing this year. But sometimes teams like this who massively kind of, outperform expectations getting into the tournament can be a little bit lackluster. I think maybe an example of this last year would have been BYU under Mark Pope at the time, who had a roster last year that was pretty underwhelming, but they were really, really good in Big 12 play. They made the tournament. They lost the first game against Duquesne. So maybe Missouri fits the bill here. And if you're thinking about any sort of plucky mid-major who has a proven player in Bennett Sturtz, has a great coach, and has a team that's just going to fight you really hard, that's Drake for sure. So I think there's upset potential there. And then, yeah, I would probably pick Texas Tech to beat the winner of that game either way.
So in the South region, Auburn has not been playing well the last week, but they're still, I mean, Janai Broome, they're amazing. Like, they've been amazing all year. They maybe hit their cold streak at the right time. I think about Baylor in 2021, their coldest part of the year. Of course, it was coming off of the entire team being stricken with COVID, but they came through the best then. So with this region, I mean, to me, I don't know who can ultimately get Auburn and Michigan State, and then coin flip on that game, to me, in my opinion, when it comes down to it.
Yeah, I think Auburn's path at least to Elite Eight is pretty straightforward. And I think really the MO for this team all year has been, let's just play our dudes and beat up on people and have some fun. And I think that's really what took people by surprise the first 2 to 3 months of the season, and when they were like clearly the best team in the country. And I think they've just let a little bit of that go recently, but they certainly are still capable of that. They have a healthy team. There's a lot of other teams that you can't say that about right now who are title favorites coming into the tournament with injury concerns. They're healthy. They have arguably the best player in Janai Broome. And I think when it's like, hey, everything is on the line here, I really think, honestly, when you look at it, a lot of it is motivation. This team won the SEC by multiple games. That was really what they were pushing for. Once they achieved that, they were kind of lackluster in the last, they lost their last, 3 of their last 4 games. But I think we shouldn't overthink this. I think Auburn is still one of the biggest threats to win the title. I think they're the best team in this region. I'm picking them to a Final Four here, partly because I think their path is relatively easy. I'm not particularly scared of a Sweet 16 matchup against Michigan or Texas A&M. It's possible, one or both of those teams don't even make it there. Michigan State obviously will be a big test, but I still think I would have Auburn as a comfortable favorite in that game. So I don't think you should overthink this. Auburn has the dudes. They've proven that when they want to lock in, they're better than anyone in the country, arguably. And so I think we're going to see a bit of a rebound for this team now that they kind of know, like, hey, we really need to whip it into shape for this tournament.
You mentioned A&M and Michigan. UC San Diego on a ridiculous heater. And watching the selection show the other day, all 4 of the guys in the room really love Yale and don't like A&M. I did watch that Michigan game the other day, and snooze fest though it was, Dusty May looks like he's got their arrow pointed up. I don't even think they're playing Dusty May basketball yet. He's just making the best of what the situation is. But with A&M and Yale, Evan, I lived this in Providence, Rhode Island a decade ago. I saw it happen. Yale is just, they're scary. Is A&M on as high alert as everybody is making it seem right now?
I certainly think there's an upset potential here in this game. The thing about Yale is they've already proven they can do this. They did this last year in the first round in about the same kind of matchup against Auburn, who was one of the strongest teams in the tournament heading in. Analytically, Auburn was a top 5 team in the country, and Yale beat them in the first round last year. And they've got, one of their stars, John Polikides, is still on this team. And so, yeah, I think that there's definitely upset potential here. And the thing with A&M is their offense at times this year has really struggled. They're a very, very good rebounding team. But in terms of making shots, in terms of making threes, it's sometimes a bit of a struggle for them. And, we've seen a lot of inconsistency from this A&M team. If A&M shows up and competes, they're probably going to beat Yale by 20. But there's a good chance that A&M just doesn't have a great night, because we've seen that this season, and it's a really close game, and potentially Yale wins this. So I definitely think there's a chance Yale can upset Texas A&M here.
How vulnerable is Iowa State with their injuries?
I would say fairly vulnerable, but the thing is that Iowa State, even with Keyshawn Gilbert in the lineup, has been Gilbert has not been himself for the last month or two. So taking him out of the lineup, it's not actually really that big of an impact based on what we've already seen recently. Iowa State, the first half of the season, was one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the country. They were very, very good. The second half of the season has not been the same. They've kind of rebounded a little bit recently. They've been better, but certainly not in that title favorite, elite status. So I think for me, sometimes people can overreact to injury news. I think Keyshawn Gilbert has arguably been one of their best players this season, if not their best, but we've not seen the best from him recently. He's out for the tournament. That's obviously a big loss for them, but they've been kind of already dealing with injuries like this for the second half of the season anyway. And so I think that Iowa State, I honestly think people are probably getting out on them a little bit too much. And I certainly think there's a chance we look up and they're still in the Final Four. So, I think they're stronger. They've shown that they are a really strong team at times this year. And I certainly think they still have the mentality to do it. They still have the guys to do it. It's going to be tough, obviously. But I don't think that they're a super, super weak 3 seed by any means.
Okay, so a couple rapid fire things. Who is your favorite double-digit seed?
My favorite double-digit seed is VCU, hands down. I think it's a coin flip in that first game, 11-seed VCU versus 6-seed BYU. VCU rates as a top 20 team in the predictive metrics right now, according to my website, and that's very similar to BYU. BYU, obviously one of the hottest teams coming into the tournament, but VCU has a very, very specific style of play that's going to be really tough to match up against. And they have one of the best, most impactful players in the country in Max Shulga, who's a really good three-point shooter. And VCU has been one of these teams that if they, their strength of their team is much better than their resume. They had to win the Atlantic 10 tournament to secure their bid in the tournament here. But VCU, I think, is my favorite double-digit seed with a chance of making it to a Sweet 16 or an Elite 8.
Okay, did the committee get it right vis-a-vis West Virginia and North Carolina?
I'm not super mad about North Carolina being in the field. According to my resume quality metrics, it was pretty much borderline on the side of them being in. But West Virginia getting left out of the tournament is absolutely wrong. And so that really is where I take issue. You can pick your team that they should have been in over North Carolina, Xavier, whatever. But West Virginia deserved to be in this field. And all the explanation I've heard from the committee was basically saying, well, it's because Tucker DeVries is out. Tucker DeVries has been out since mid-December. Like, we've already seen that West Virginia can be a great team without him. That shouldn't matter at all. So I think that one was wrong.
And did they put too many SEC teams in?
Yes. I'm not super mad about it. But I think, getting Texas in the field was a little bit borderline. And so I just did not think that when we looked at this bracket, we would see 14. I thought we would see 13, and one of them who thought they might get in wouldn't. It's not super undeserved. This conference has been the best in the country. I think just purely weighting how good was your conference this year by number of NCAA tournament bids is a little bit weird, because that can kind of change depending on just like how many bubble caliber teams you have. So we were looking at anywhere between 12 and 14 SEC teams for the last month, ended up with 14. So I do think it probably should have been one less, but ultimately this conference earned it.
Evan Miyakawa, evanmiya.com. Please go to his website if you're a college basketball fan and you're not there. You're not really that much of a college basketball fan, in my opinion. You're still in AA ball if you're not on evanmiya.com. Evan, thank you so much. Always love when you hop on. And you've informed my bracket. I appreciate that because, listen, I'm a winner, and I don't lose at these things, despite what history will tell you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Always good to talk with you.
Evan Miyakawa,